The story begins in a prison in Russia where we see a man named Frank Abagnale Jr. Frank is a highly skilled con artist who has pulled off some major scams. At this point, an FBI agent named Carl has come to bring him back to the United States. While Carl is talking to him, Frank suddenly starts feeling very sick. At first, Carl thinks it's just another trick, but then he realizes no one could fake it that well. He rushes Frank to the hospital. However, Frank sees an opportunity and tries to escape again. The police quickly catch him, and as he's taken back, he starts remembering how everything began. Frank was born into a happy family. His parents loved each other deeply. One day, his father took him to buy a suit from a store. The woman there said the shop was closed. Frank's father quickly pulled out a necklace and casually asked if it belonged to her. Impressed by his smooth move, she allowed them to shop anyway. Frank's father was very clever in situations like that. Later, his father had him pretend to be the driver while he went into a bank. The bank manager greeted him personally. Frank's father had suffered heavy business losses and needed a loan. Because of an accountant's mistake, he had paid his taxes late and faced serious penalties. Despite explaining everything, no bank was willing to help. The government eventually seized his car, property, and money. Even during tough times, though, he opened a bank account for Frank. When Frank asked why, his father told him not to worry about him and to focus on building his own future. Because of the financial trouble, Frank had to switch schools. On his first day, a boy made fun of him for dressing too formally and said he looked like a teacher. Angry and embarrassed, Frank decided to act like one. He walked into a classroom and told the actual teacher that it was his class and she could come back later. Confused and overwhelmed, she left. Frank then embarrassed the boy in front of everyone. It took about a week before the school realized that a student had been pretending to teach a class, especially when he was about to take the class on a trip. His parents were called in. His father stayed serious in front of the principal, but later he laughed about it with Frank. One day, when Frank came home, he saw another man in his mother's bedroom. The man worked with his father. His mother tried to act like nothing was going on and even gave Frank some money, but he understood the truth. A few days later, his parents decided to separate. A lawyer asked Frank whether he wanted to live with his mother or father. Watching his family fall apart broke his heart. He couldn't handle it and ran away to another city. He didn't have much money, just his bank account and a checkbook. He started writing checks to pay for hotel stays. When those checks began to bounce, the hotels kicked him out. One day, he realized he could alter the checks. This was a time before advanced technology, so it was easier to get away with it. He slowly began creating fake checks, writing different names on them and cashing them at banks. If a bank manager refused to cash one, he would confidently use tricks he had learned from his father, like the necklace move, to win them over. For a while, it worked, but eventually his checks started getting flagged and banks stopped accepting them. One day, he noticed a pilot standing outside a hotel. Everyone treated the pilot with respect. That gave Frank an idea. Why not become a pilot? He planned to pay with a check, but an employee told him that if he had a pilot ID, the airline would cover the bill. Frank created a fake pilot ID and even managed to get a uniform for free. After that, he walked into a bank where no one used to take him seriously. This time, the manager personally came over and cashed his check without hesitation. Later, he discovered through a hotel that he wasn't limited to cashing small checks. He could withdraw large sums as well, as long as the check appeared to be a payroll check. That's when Frank began creating his own fake salary checks. He would peel the airline logo off toy airplanes and paste it neatly onto the check. With the forged payroll check in hand, he walked into a bank, but the manager informed him, "Sir, you can cash this directly at the airport." At the airport, Frank could cash almost any check without trouble, and he absolutely loved that advantage. The receptionist there smiled and asked, "Are you flying with us today?" Frank nodded confidently, and she escorted him straight onto the plane. Pilots could board free of charge. Of course, Frank wasn't a real pilot, and inside he was terrified, but in front of everyone, he carried himself with bold confidence. Soon after, he approached a charming flight attendant and asked, "Is this your necklace?" Using a clever trick he had learned from his father, he managed to impress her. Frank looked slightly older than his actual age, so no one suspected that he wasn't truly a 22 or 23-year-old professional pilot. He was fully enjoying the life he had built. He even began flirting with a bank manager while carefully studying the entire banking system, where checks were issued, how they were cleared, how account numbers were assigned. He absorbed every detail. He learned that banks used typewriters to encode checks, so he purchased a similar second-hand typewriter himself. By now, Frank's work no longer looked amateurish. It had become highly professional. Gradually, he started withdrawing larger and larger amounts, and his fraud scheme kept expanding. News of his activities eventually reached the FBI, and the case was assigned to an agent named Carl. Carl took his responsibilities very seriously. One day, Frank visited his father, whom he regularly updated through letters about his so-called career. His father truly believed his son had become a pilot and felt immense pride. Frank told him, "The government took everything from you, so I bought you a car with my own earnings, the same kind James Bond drives in the movies." But his father replied, "After the tax scandal, the government is still after me. If I take this car, they'll seize it in a few days." His store had shut down, and he was struggling financially. Frank offered him money, but his father refused, saying he couldn't accept it. By this point, Frank thoroughly understood how the country's system worked. He would cash checks from one state in a completely different state. Meanwhile, the FBI was closely monitoring his every move. Soon, they traced him to the hotel where he had passed his most recent check. During questioning, they discovered that Frank was still staying there. He had been there so long that he had become familiar with everyone on staff.
Carl, carrying a gun, went straight to Frank's room. Frank realized that without a clever move, he would be caught. Calmly, he said, "Relax, I'm with the Secret Service. What did you think? You're the only one tracking this guy? The entire government is after him." Carl demanded, "Show me your ID. How do I know you are who you claim to be?" Frank replied smoothly, "Here, take my wallet and check everything carefully." Carl struggled to open the wallet with one hand. At that moment, Frank glanced outside and said, "Look, our men have already captured the con artist. We got here before you." Down below, one of Frank's neighbors was helping a blind man into a car. From a distance, it appeared as though someone had been apprehended. Carl began to believe him. Frank gathered all his fake check-making equipment and said, "The police will be here shortly. Let me take this evidence downstairs." By now, Carl trusted him completely. He even said, "Take your wallet back." But Frank deliberately replied, "No, you keep it." Then, carrying the essentials, he slipped away. A little while later, when Carl finally opened the wallet, he found nothing inside. The cunning con man had escaped right before his eyes. Realizing this left Carl deeply humiliated. His boss reprimanded him harshly. Furious and embarrassed, Carl lashed out and argued back at his own superior. The way Frank kept pretending to be a pilot slowly started drawing attention from the airlines. Bit by bit, they began to suspect something wasn't right. Repeating the same scam over and over was becoming risky. When the press caught wind of the story, they nicknamed him James Bond. Frank absolutely loved it. He began dressing in sharp suits just like Bond, and even bought a similar car to match the image. As time passed, Christmas season arrived. Carl was alone in his office working late when the phone rang. It was Frank. He said he wanted to apologize for everything he had done so far. This time, he even gave Carl an address. But Carl replied coldly, "You're trying to trap me again, aren't you? I'm not falling for it this time." He added, "You may have money, but you're lonely. That's why you're calling me." Those words stung Frank deeply, and he hung up. The truth, however, was that Frank had actually given his real address. The last time Carl had spoken to him, Frank had introduced himself as Barry Allen, a comic book character. That detail stuck with Carl. He called his office and said, "We're not looking for a grown man. We're chasing a kid who just looks older than he is. That's why we can't find him." Carl ordered a list of teenagers who had run away from home. Someone must have filed a report, he insisted. After digging through records and cross-checking information, Carl finally traced Frank's home and met his mother. When shown a photograph, she confirmed, "Yes, that's my son." Carl told her he's a professional con artist. If you hear from him, inform the police immediately. His mother softly responded, maybe he just took a little money for food. She picked up her purse and said, I'll pay it back. How much does he owe? Carl answered, $1.4 million. Hearing that, she was left speechless.
Meanwhile, Frank had moved to another city and was living a comfortable life. One day, he visited a hospital for some work. There, he noticed a nurse named Brenda crying after being scolded by a doctor. Frank comforted her, saying, "Don't worry, you're amazing. That doctor's the one who's crazy." At that moment, an idea sparked in his mind. He casually asked Brenda if there were any job openings at the hospital. Being a pilot had become too dangerous, so Frank decided it was time to become a doctor instead. He forged a Harvard degree and prepared for the interview by giving random advice and speaking confidently. During his free time, he and Brenda grew closer and eventually fell for each other. Then one day, an emergency case arrived. A young child had been severely injured. The sight of blood shook Frank to his core. Still, he maintained his composure and turned to another doctor asking, "What would you do in this situation?" After hearing the response, Frank nodded and said, "Exactly right. I'm confident you can handle it. I'll check back shortly." With that, he stepped away, but in reality, he was completely panicked. On the other side, Carl visited Frank's father and revealed all of Frank's crimes. His father said firmly, "I don't know where he is, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Carl realized how close father and son were. He must be sending letters, Carl thought. By analyzing the letters lying around, he calculated where Frank might be living. Soon, he prepared to head there with the police. Back in the city, Frank and Brenda had grown deeply attached. One day, Brenda broke down in tears and confessed that she had once had an abortion, after which her father threw her out of the house. After thinking for a moment, Frank said, "If I speak to your father about marriage, do you think he'll accept you again?" Brenda felt hopeful hearing that. Then Frank went to meet her father, who was a lawyer, so naturally Frank claimed that he too had once practiced law before becoming a doctor. He had watched enough courtroom films to sound convincing, and with his smooth talk, he impressed everyone. Brenda's father asked him directly, "Tell me honestly, what did a man like you see in my daughter?" Frank replied sincerely, "I'm just an ordinary man who loves your daughter." That answer left Brenda's father deeply impressed. Then Frank asked, "If I wanted to practice law here, what would I need to do?" Her father replied, "Since you've already completed law school, you'd only need to pass the bar exam. After that, you can practice here." After that, Frank actually studied for real, sat for the exam legitimately, and passed, earning his license as a lawyer. The story then shifts back to the present, where Carl has finally arrested him. Carl asks, "How did you even manage to pass that exam?" Frank shrugs and replies, "What difference does it make now? You're taking me to prison, not to court." The narrative moves backward again. We see Frank bonding warmly with Brenda's family. He was just about to marry her. He expressed a desire to meet his father and told him confidently, "Everything the government took from us, we'll get it all back. And then you'll bring Mom home too, and we'll live together like we used to."
But his father broke the news that his mother had remarried. Hearing this crushed Frank. Then his father added that he had learned about all of Frank's scams. That revelation hit even harder, and Frank quietly walked away. That night, Carl called Frank. He told him he was getting married and wanted to forget everything that had happened between them. Deep down, he hoped all the charges against him would somehow disappear. Carl responded firmly, "As long as I have this badge, I'll never stop chasing you. You can't escape what you've done." After that conversation, Carl formed a new plan. He had read that after marriage, Frank wouldn't be able to change his legal name easily. Carl ordered searches under the alias Frank had used while posing as a doctor. He reasoned that wedding invitations must have been printed somewhere, so he began monitoring printing presses and related services. When the wedding day arrived, agents showed up at the ceremony. The moment Frank noticed them, he quickly took Brenda to their room. There, he confessed everything, that he had spent years deceiving people, but his love for her was genuine. He told her, "I have to run now.
"Meet me at the airport, and don't tell anyone where you're going." The next day, Frank waited anxiously at the airport. Brenda did arrive, but she wasn't alone. Agents were with her. Escaping seemed nearly impossible. Then Frank devised another bold move. He went to a college campus and announced that his airline was hiring a large number of flight attendants. After conducting several interviews, he selected a group of attractive young women. Dressed in his pilot uniform and surrounded by them, he confidently walked into the airport. The officers became distracted by the glamorous group, and Frank slipped through unnoticed. Meanwhile, a young man who resembled Frank stood outside the airport with a car. The FBI agents chased and detained him, only to learn he had been paid to stand there. By the time they realized the trick, Frank had already fled the country. Over the next few years, he carried out major frauds across different nations. The last location traced to him revealed that he was printing checks again. Carl requested permission from his superiors to go after him personally, but they dismissed the idea, saying, "We couldn't catch him here. How do you expect to catch him abroad?" Carl continued investigating on his own. He discovered that Frank was now having his checks professionally printed. He knew Frank was somewhere in Russia, but Russia was vast. Then he remembered that Frank's mother had once lived in a small Russian village. After digging deeper, he learned there was a printing press there. It was Christmas Eve once again when Carl arrived. This time he found Frank. Frank greeted him casually and said, "Come on, I'll show you around. Let's step outside." Carl warned him, "Don't even think about running. The local police won't hesitate to shoot." Then he added, "If you surrender now, I can help you." Frank hesitated and said, "Swear on your children." Carl swore and assured him he was telling the truth. Trusting him, Frank allowed the handcuffs to be placed on his wrists.
When they stepped outside, there was no one in sight. For a brief moment, Frank wondered if he had been fooled again. But seconds later, police cars surrounded the area. The story returns to the present. Carl and Frank are about to land in America. Just before landing, Frank says softly, "I want to speak to my father." With a heavy heart, Carl tells him that his father had passed away after slipping in the bathroom. The news devastates Frank. He walks into the restroom on the plane and breaks down, sobbing uncontrollably. The plane was only minutes away from landing, yet Frank still hadn't stepped out of the restroom. Growing suspicious, Carl forced the door open to check if he was inside. But by then, Frank had already unscrewed the sink fixture and crawled into the aircraft's internal compartment. The moment the landing gear deployed and the plane touched down, Frank seized his chance and escaped. That very night, he went to see his mother. From a distance, he realized she had rebuilt her life. She had a new family now, and even a young daughter. Carl, however, knew Frank well enough to predict his next move. He was sure Frank would try to see his mother. Sure enough, Carl arrived there and arrested him. Frank was still under 19. Carl believed he should be treated as a minor, but the government wanted to make an example out of him for such a massive fraud. He was sentenced to 10 years in solitary confinement, cut off from meaningful human contact. Days blurred into months. Then one day, Carl came to visit. A similar fraud had surfaced. Someone else was pulling off the same kind of scam Frank once did. Frank asked to see the check. The moment he examined it, he pointed out subtle flaws in the encoding and layout. Carl immediately understood that the only person capable of stopping crimes like this was Frank himself. The next time Carl visited, he brought several FBI agents along. They were impressed by how quickly Frank dissected the scheme and explained how it worked. Gradually, Carl managed to arrange Frank's release and offered him a position with the FBI. Now, Frank had to work 8 hours a day. Life had given him another opportunity, but with strict conditions. If he ever tried to run again, he would face a 50-year sentence. Determined to change, he tried to adjust to the routine, but boredom soon crept in. One day, he accessed his own FBI file and erased parts of his record. Over the weekend, he was on the verge of fleeing to another country,
but Carl intercepted him. "Listen," Carl said calmly, "life has handed you a second chance. If you run now, you'll spend the rest of your life behind bars. I'm not going to physically stop you, but be back at work on Monday. Remember, no one is chasing you anymore. There's nothing left to run from." Frank walked away. On Monday morning, Carl waited anxiously at his desk. For a moment, he feared Frank had disappeared again, but then Frank walked through the door. From that day on, he worked brilliantly on case after case, using his unique insight to outsmart criminals. Soon, Frank found someone he loved and got married. He began building a stable and honest life. After earning respect within the FBI, he eventually launched his own company dedicated to preventing banking and financial fraud. After all, who better to catch thieves than someone who once mastered the art himself? This is a true story, one where Frank ultimately became a millionaire the right way. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.